Good afternoon, all you folks. Hello, hello. Okay, welcome all, and welcome those online. It is an incredible pleasure and honour to introduce our VIP seminar speaker today, as part of the Centre for Climate Sciences seminars. And this is something I've been looking forward to for quite some time. The topic is obviously about a kind of a real giant in our science, and I'm not going to say any much more about it than that because Jim's going to tell us all about this person and this person's achievements. But just as a way of introduction, Jim actually had some time at CSU where he did a master's in cloud science, and he decided that wasn't for him. Particularly when he almost crashed in a research aircraft, he thought there's got to be a better way to get involved in science than fly an aircraft and almost kill yourself. So he moved into history and he moved from a master's in Colorado State, and before that he did his undergraduate as a Penn State, astronomy in Penn State, yeah. And anyway, after experiencing the trials and tribulations of research in the field, he said, that's not for me. And he went on and did a Ph.D. in history from Princeton University, totally different kind of genre, but he brought these threads together, and he became the founding member of the Committee on the History of Meteorology of the AMS, and has been very instrumental in articulating why history in science, and he's going to continue that a little bit, I guess, today. There's so many accolades of Jim, and his books are a great read, and this topic today is also in his latest book. So by all means, we welcome Jim and really look forward to the seminar. Thank you, Jim.
Thanks, Cool. So am I okay with the mic? I am delighted to be here. I'm really happy when I got the invitation. I'm really pleased to speak to such a distinguished group. And I'm going to talk exclusively about Joanne Simpson and the tropical atmosphere. This is a book. It's on campus now. I gave one to Graham. Am I allowed to say that?
Yes. And you can borrow it as long as you
Cool. So this is a hot tower, and metaphorically, we consider Joan to be like that. I had to play with the language a bit, but we were thinking of the topic hot towers for the title, but it didn't make it. And then the other metaphor is the trade wind cumulus. This is the fair weather cumulus that don't quite make it up and pass through the tropical boundary. So this is about the tropical atmosphere as well. And I said to myself, if I was going to write a history of tropical atmosphere research, say from the 1940s, I could have used Herb Reel, who was the founder of our Colorado State program, but I could have read 3,000 papers from 1,000 different authors. But instead, in this book, I used Joanne's course and her understanding of the tropics to sort of begin to cobble together a history of the tropical atmosphere. Because most histories of meteorology are about the polar front. Most of them are about men. Most of them are in the temperate zone. And so that kind of historiography that focuses on the northern weather needs a complement. And World War II, especially her trajectory of her career with the Pacific campaign in World War II and the bomb tests in the Pacific, and the need for tropical understanding and eventually attempted forecasting and satellite observations. I don't know who did that. But which emoji would you like? The one with the mask on it, or the? Oh, I think I leaned on this thing. Okay, so I forgot where I was. So anyway, it's about the tropical atmosphere, but mostly it's Joanne, and she was a distinguished scholar, acknowledged by Radcliffe Institute at Harvard, invited to put her papers in there, starting about 1990. And she took it really deeply to heart, and she put everything that she had, pictures, her dance shoes, her ballet shoes, a little silver iodide mock-up canister in there, And it's a wonderful place. I took my students down from Maine. It's a 3-hour bus ride. We'd go down in the morning, and by noon or so, they would have their white gloves on, and they'd be in the archival boxes, and they were instantly becoming historians by contact. So it was a great opportunity to introduce other people that helped me work on the book. Okay, we'll see. We go forward. That's the book cover. First woman. It was a takeoff on there's a book out called First Man. It was about Neil Armstrong, and I said, well, what the hell? I'll do First Woman, who was the pioneer, and I made the point that she was not just the best woman scientist of her era. She was the best scientist, and she worked with Herb Reel. She worked with Rossby. She made the first, before I forget to say this, she made the first cloud model with Rossby's BESC computer. It was a convection model, really. And she really did, I ended up with the historian's dilemma of really admiring her. And yet, she was also self-critical and really tried to be, bare bones about things in her archive. So it wasn't too hard to be objective about it. So it's her life and work. It's also a study of women in science. And it's a lot of never-before-seen photos and archival materials that brought together. There's actually a box that I had the honor of opening for the first time because it was on a time restriction. And I'll tell you about that a little bit later on. You might know some of these people. There's people like Peggy Lamone, Chris Kummerow. I don't see any nods yet. Rick Anthes, Stephen Rutledge, Bill Cotton, Christina Katsaros, Jeff Halverson, and Warren Washington. They're all on videotape, and the link is in the book. And what I did, I got a high-quality small video camera, put it on a tripod, and I just said, "Tell us your best story." And then I was quiet, and they talked for on the order of 2 to 3 minutes. So they're not long. There's a YouTube channel, and you can see some people saying, "I thought I knew Joanne, but I didn't know all these dimensions about her." So anyway, it's a historical approach. She was a pilot. She was in charge. She was a PI, and she learned how to fly. Her father helped her learn how to fly. He was the aviation editor for the Boston Herald, I'm sorry. And those are her dates, 1923 to 2010. In charge of missions where a woman had never been in charge. She worked at Woods Hole, and they had a restriction, especially on their shipboard. They wouldn't even let women go out on the ships. And in their aviation program, she got permission, not just permission, but they said no. The Navy said no, Joanne, no funding, and so they were very strong about having her be the PI. This is how it started out. I think this is probably about the first letter I read in the archive. And she said, "I've been interviewed extensively. There's lots of media coverage of her early life and how she feels about her work, but they don't give a balanced picture. They don't show what the heart and feelings were of her tasks. They give the impression that an ambitious, single-minded scientist. Most people think I'm a pretty cool character." Let's wait for it. Nothing could be further from the truth. So she was self-revelatory. I mean, she said all those interviews, all that coverage of my work up through the 2000s didn't cover what she was really about. And to understand how a woman or a man, for that matter, creates original work in any field, you have to penetrate the emotional masks. She kept her masks on because she was afraid that if she really let them off during her career, it would hurt her career. But she also thought it would hurt other women in science. It would also prejudice some people. So she proposed to take them off. She took the gloves off in the archives. And that's how she wrote her biography. There's even a letter in there. I felt like it was, in some way, it was written to me. It said, "I expect by putting all this stuff in the archive that some historian will take this up and take this story forward and write my, biography instead of my autobiography." So that was pretty important to me. And that's the first box of the Simpson papers, which are open for research. If you'd like to take a trip to Cambridge, you can go to the Radcliffe Institute, and they'll take real good care of you. And you can check my stuff, see if I'm really telling the truth. This is way too busy, but the bare bones are her appointments and things that she did professionally. And so we'll go here without overdoing this. We'll go from Chicago to the NASA. So she had lots of appointments, and I'll try to go through them quickly during the talk. But in the flesh and blood side, you know, she had a lifelong struggle with her mother, who really didn't want her as a baby. It was born in a point in her mother's life where her mother wanted to professionalize, and so she had a tough childhood. She went to Chicago instead of Radcliffe. Her grandmother and her mother were both Radcliffe people. And the expectation was Joanne will go to Radcliffe, maybe study something in humanities. She took off for Chicago, studied with Rossby, and got married there to another meteorologist. You probably heard of Victor Starr. Had children, divorced Starr, met the love of her life, that I'll tell you about, which was in the restricted box. Married again to a mathematician, Willem Malkus, who worked most of his career at Woods Hole. Had 2 more children, and then goodbye to Malkus. And then she married Robert Simpson, who was really like a partner for her in later life. So she found her pace, she found her happiness, she found her professional later in life, from 1979. She loved NASA. She could share with other women employees at NASA, and she could really accomplish what she wanted to accomplish finally. The other appointments, not so happy. So she was looking for love. She was looking to please her mother, and she was looking to find her professional niche in an era when it was really a man's world, and it really. I'll show you some of that in a minute.
Are most of her scientific papers?
Trying to go back.
Are most of?
I'm going forward.
It's okay. Her scientific papers and Joanne Malkus and then Joanne Simpson. What was her original last name?
You're so perceptive. I mean, she's Joanne Gerold. She then becomes Joanne Starr. She has one paper called Joanne Starr, and then another one called Joanne Starr Malkus. And then there's the Malkus papers that she worked with Herb Reel. And then there's Joanne Simpson. So at some point in the book, I said, let's just call her Joanne, because if you look at her CV, it goes with the nomenclature of married life naming back from the 40s and 50s. I'm not sure how I got that far forward. I want to go backwards. I'm not going backwards. No, I'm going backwards. Okay, so this is the first picture of her. She's holding her mother's actual Teddy Roosevelt teddy bear. There's a big deal. I guess the second box I opened was a story of Teddy, and it was her mother's homage to her teddy bear from Teddy Roosevelt. And she said, my mother would only let me hold it and take a picture when I was sick, but she wouldn't let me play with it. And that sort of set the tone. It was this mystery. When you're doing historical research, you wonder, what does this mean? And what context? You don't have the big picture. And you have a little piece of the puzzle. And she was telling us after her passing that she was an unhappy child. And her mother holds her here. It's on a boat. They were going to go boating. It looks like she's crying. This is July 1924. So she's only about 2 or 3 months old. And the most traumatic event in her life occurred when she was 5, when her mother's given her younger brother a bath, and she said, why don't you snuggle with me and kiss me? And her mother says, you have to be lovable to be loved. And that seared her. I mean, it just really stunned her. And this is her own writing. It gave me a clear message that I was unlovable, permanent condition. And she spent a substantial part of her life trying to make herself lovable and even likable. So she'd go out and write these prize-winning papers and win awards, and she'd bring them to her mother. And there's documentation that the mother was like, so what? It was really tough, really tough. So she not only had to challenge the man's world of meteorology at the time and the military world and the Woods Hole standards, but she had to challenge this family situation as a pioneer woman in our field. Her dad, Russell Gerold, was an aviation correspondent. He was friends with Lindbergh, and they were able to meet Charles Lindbergh at the time. And he took her swimming, rowing, They looked at clouds. She got her first exposure to the environment, to the natural world, the love of it off the coast of Massachusetts, and allowed her to steer the car, and actually later on gave her aviation lessons. My mother rarely did. She adds these things on the back of the photos, and I have to take that evidence as really coming from their heart. And then she said my mother got furiously angry at me at times. Here's a picture with her and Teddy again. She's ill again. Her brother had the measles. She was dejected, and this is right outside of Cambridge, right in Cambridge, pictured with her mother's teddy bear. So that's kind of like a visual image of her early life. As I said, she was intended to go to Radcliffe. She was intended to follow the family tradition, and she went to Chicago. She got on the train and just headed west, and she was seeking a new start. She trained. She studied all the great classics of the first freshman's curriculum, and then she got into meteorology. She got in there in a very interesting way. She went in for a 20-minute interview with Rossby about what to do with her degree. And she came out as a candidate for training the World War II cadet generation. And she hadn't finished basic physics and math yet, so she took 3 courses in the summer and ended up in the fall teaching in the cadet program at NYU and then back at Chicago. At that time, she married meteorologist Victor Starr, but she was not. Starr never told her that 2 married people can't work at Chicago at the same time. She said, "Oh my God, what did I just do?" So, and she found this out after the marriage, that she was on the faculty as an instructor, and teaching the basic course, and then she's out suddenly. So where'd she go? Illinois Institute of Technology, to teach physics. Her graduate student advisor. Now, I think everybody here is or at some point had a graduate advisor or was thinking about, what if your graduate advisor said, no woman has ever earned a Ph.D. in meteorology, no woman ever will. Even if you did, no one would give you a job. Talk about advisor. But there's other evidence of that kind of atmosphere at the University of Chicago at the time. A senior colleague, this part's redacted, but said to her, "It's an ironic tragedy to see the brain of a man in the body of a woman." About 1945 or so. She has a child in arms. She's getting divorced from Starr. She's making ends meet by part-time teaching at University of Illinois, or Illinois Institute of Technology. And she's just toughing it out, basically. And then she gets this. So near the end of that, right before she got her PhD, she found Willem Malkus, who was more amenable. They had a second child, Stephen, in Chicago. And then she took Herb Reel's graduate course on tropical. Reel was beginning to think about writing his great work on tropical meteorology. And she took this graduate seminar where she heard about trade wind clouds, new data that came from Woods Hole. They had done a study, aircraft study of the clouds, and Joanne had this light bulb come on. She has cartoons of herself with a light bulb above her head saying, "That's what I want to do, study clouds the rest of my life." And she didn't want to study them from afar or just theoretically. Her first part of her dissertation is sort of a Rossby-like study of cloud formation and the trade winds. And then the second part is about going out into the clouds and flying in the clouds and being able to have firsthand experience with the tropics. So that's what she did, basically. She was very much out there. Rossby didn't think that much of hiring women. He had her in the graduate program. He was on his way to Sweden, so he was leaving Chicago. And he said, "Your work on clouds is great for a little girl, but they're unimportant, so nobody else is interested, and you'll stand out like a sore thumb." So you can make your mark by standing out like a sore thumb, is what he's telling her. Rossby's interesting. Everybody knows something about Rossby, but he had already finished his upper air work, and he defined planetary waves, and he was working on things in the upper atmosphere. And then suddenly says, "Well, I've solved that problem pretty much with what we know today. I'm going to move into the global environment." So he moved to Sweden and started the journal Tellus. Began working on the carbon dioxide problem, acid rain. the kind of things that are more like environmental science connected with meteorology. But he wasn't out of her life because he sponsored her first sabbatical visit from Woods Hole to Sweden. I did a little study. There's more to be done. That's one of the lessons of history. There's always more that you can do. You can dig deeper into this. But I took a look at the state of tropical meteorology circa 1950. That was the year, 51 was the year that the Compendium of Meteorology came out from the American Meteorological Society. And in about a 1,300-page volume, a gigantic book, there's about 50 to 60 pages on tropics. There's a little bit on tropics. And following some of those leads, you get the basic approaches were the climatological approach, like the tropics vary very little from day to day, from year to year. Here's what you're going to see. Descriptive, but not forecasting kind of meteorology, which is standard ever since Hadley, I guess. Then there was an attempt to bring the Bergen School down into the tropics, looking for the mythical tropical front that would solve this whole thing. Sort of like instead of polar front, you would have equatorial front. And then there was another school coming out of Rossby, was the perturbation school. And that had some merit because they were looking for these propagating easterly waves associated with hurricane formation, but they weren't able to really monitor and measure them. But that was the Chicago school, and that's what Joanne jumped into initially, and then realized that math and theoretical meteorology were not her forte, but she was able to stay with the tropics the rest of her life. By 1950, her biggest contribution was on-site observations, models of clouds. When she was on sabbatical from Woods Hole, she went to England. She studied with the British group. And during a portion of that time, she was invited over to Sweden. And Rossby came to visit in England. She saw Joanne with a handheld, with a big table full of computations. And she was doing this box and moving it to that box and moving it here. She says, I have a computer, the BESC, that can move that kind of computation from cell to cell. So she went over, and you'll find this paper in the Rossby Memorial volume, because she was going to write it for his 60th birthday, but then he died before that celebration. So you'll find an early convective model in that volume, which is one of the first models, the first computer model. I think it actually scoops, I think chronologically it scoops the numerical weather prediction models that came out of Princeton. But she was over there with Rossby working on this. And there's interesting stories about that. But she was out flying. She went with the Woods Hole team into the tropics. And she did later this thing called experimental meteorology, where she would run her model, see what the model said about the daily conditions, then go out and try some cloud seeding. So later in life, she was assigned to an experimental meteorology group. Here's Claude. Claude Ronnie is the third major man in her life. And he was a photographer at Woods Hole. And she says it was love at first sight. I mean, she goes on and on about this. They became both intellectually and romantically engaged at Woods Hole. They flew missions together in the Caribbean. They flew across the Pacific together. It's very intimate. There's notes that they passed across the aisle of the plane as they were flying, and they did all kind of stuff together. She documented this in 3 handwritten diaries, personal letters and notes, but the notes were not available till 5 years after her passing, 2015. Claude Ronnie. There's the box. It was sitting on the shelf. I went in 2015 in August, and I worked on the papers, and I looked up and I said, what's that red box with all the tape around it? And they said, oh, that's restricted. I said, restricted till when? They said, oh, let me look it up. Oh, January 2015. I said, this is August 2015, bring it. And when I opened it, there were the 3 very clearly written diary notes, some letters, some papers, some stuff that had never been seen before. So that's really exciting to a historian, to make that kind of a breakthrough, kind of a discovery that day. And that was a closed folder. So they flew together. This is the PBY sort of flying boat given to them by the Navy. Joanne was the PI. This is Claude next to her, photography specialist. Then they were all men crew, and Joanne was on the PBY. Of course, there was no facilities on the PBY. I noticed how the ambiance of the team changed a bit when a woman gets in there, and there's some interesting observations about that, how they had to do different things than going out to the bars all the time. And this was provided by the Office of Naval Research, which said to Woods Hole, no Joanne, no airplane. So you have to take her. She's the one that we went up there on the plane. Joanne and Claude had this passionate relationship, and she wrote in her diary, I had a candlelight dinner with Claude, and I felt like a princess. When I think of dancing, it'll be with you. And it goes on and on. I actually transcribed the whole box, the whole red restricted box, and I don't even know how to get that published, but I think it's a kind of a content for a film, you know, it's content for a romantic movie. She counted the moments they shared at the greatest of treasure, and she was really, really deeply found love that she didn't have from her mother or her first two husbands. They hitchhiked across the Pacific, if you can imagine. They went on military air transport from San Francisco to across to Hawaii, and then eventually to the Far East. And what they were doing was called the Pacific Cloud Hunt. They were looking for convective clusters. They were looking for hot towers, and they had information about, you know, the gigantic ice phases that were brewing in the tropics and the cumulonimbus clouds. So they took a lot of cameras. They had kind of this time together crossing the Pacific, and she was able to use, this is a picture of her using the camera, and what they did was they made motion pictures of the clouds so they could do a frame-by-frame analysis of their growth. She published a book on this. It was on Pacific convection, and the review of it, I think it was done by Bob Flegel, about 1965 or so. The book says, wait a minute, you know, she did this intense hand-drawn study of clouds just as the satellite imagery came and could stream that kind of information. So that the timing of this was, in a way, unfortunate, that she did it by hand and then it was done more automatically. Okay, there's my metaphor. Trade wind cumuli become a metaphor for a lot of women that joined meteorology and reached not a glass ceiling, but a trade wind inversion ceiling. And they couldn't break through to higher levels because of the bureaucracy and because of their situation. There's a lot of women in meteorology. In World War II, there were a lot of people launching balloons and analyzing data and preparing pilots. And Joanne was the person that broke through. And that's about the time she did her hot tower study with Herb Reel. So it was Joanne Malkus, with Herb Reel, and they come up with this notion and this theory, basically hypothesis, that it was the hot towers, which are actually rare, statistically rare, but they are incredibly important in driving the tropical circulation. And because they drive the tropical circulation, they drive the global circulation. And so they're like spark plugs. She had the spark plug engine running in a cumulonimbus cloud, especially in clusters of them, that would lead to the dynamics of the global atmosphere. Rossby missed this. He said clouds are unimportant. He had big arrows, he had big diagrams, he had big trade winds and westerlies, and he published this extensively. And she gave a reunion talk at Chicago one time, and it was after Rossby's demise, but she did say, in her own sort of, in a modest way, she said, I think we've done something that Rossby didn't do. We went out in the clouds and we saw how important they are. And then they made this theory of the hot tower convection. Now, there's a little science in here. So I think there's some scientists in the room. But this is the one science slide, if you would. And it goes like this. The atmosphere is stable, except when it isn't. And if you look at the updraft balanced by the downdrafts, the way I say it is sometimes the upward and downward mass flows cancel, but for every cloud there's a clear space, for every storm there's a high pressure area, and it's all kind of in balance. But this is what she was doing. She was doing this pioneer work on these strong updrafts and making the dynamics of that available to other theorists, hot towers. She was on CBS Conquest program in 1958. This is a still picture from the film. This is a short series of like 15-minute human interest young scientists would get in there. And she was demonstrating how Pacific cloud films were projected and guided and gridded, in order to make her maps. So she would hand draw what she was photographing and look at the time evolution of this. I think I've heard something about that this morning, about how the train of satellites is looking at development of cluster convection. I was able to take a pretty high quality video camera, put it on a little tripod, and go to see these people. I told you about the YouTube links. You can go visit them yourself. But here's Peggy Limon. I think the interest, she's in her office at NCAR. And Peggy worked with Joanne. They did the survey of women in meteorology. They also developed the AMS minorities and women interest group and committee. And she has a little cloud above her head right here. So it was just on the blackboard. So I just said, Peggy, she told me 5 or 6 different stories. I picked this one, and we'll let it run, and we'll see how it runs if we can. Are you in charge of this, or am I in charge? How do we run that little?
I'm looking at clouds and talking about clouds, and she studied clouds, and I thought, you can do that? That's what I want to do. Okay, anytime. Is it already starting?
Go ahead.
Okay. I learned only fairly recently that a film that influenced me strongly as a child had Joanne Simpson in the movie. It would have been somewhere around the mid to late 1950s, and I was in my brother's bedroom. He was an electronics whiz. He liked to put together things, and he had a TV put together in his bedroom. And I was sitting on the floor, and on came this fascinating piece about clouds. And there was a woman looking at steam coming up from a cup of coffee and talking about clouds. And there were pictures of clouds and airplanes flying through clouds, and she was talking about how she studied clouds. And I was just totally delighted, because from the time when I was about 8 years old, when the lightning struck our house, I'd been fascinated by weather. But I didn't know if girls could be meteorologists. It almost seemed like there was something wrong with that. But there she was, and she seemed to be quite coherent, and she seemed to know what she was doing. And I think that made me far more comfortable with the decision to become a meteorologist. So by the time I was 13 years old, in 7th grade, and they asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? I wrote, meteorologist. I think I might have had to ask the teacher to help me spell it. But that desire continued, and that's what I am today.
Cool. Okay, so it was good to get the voices of people that worked with her involved. This is her own slide. She had done a lot of presentations. She wasn't too shy about talking about her work, and she talks about the progress she had made in the 1960s through new technologies, the multi-aircraft arrays that she had experienced in projects like GATE, radars that were coming on, computers, early satellites. And she was involved in the National Hurricane Research Project with her lifelong partner, who she married, Bob Simpson. And he's also a very well-known tropical meteorologist, director of the National Hurricane Center. So there's Bob and Joanne after 1960s. About 65 they married. And they were able to look at cumulus again and how they drive the hurricanes. There's this thing about the eye wall of the hurricane and how it affects hurricane dynamics. Again, back to bare bones. She got a full professorship with Malkus at UCLA, but she had to leave behind her intimate Woods Hole community, where they were really close to each other at Woods Hole, all the colleagues. And she didn't like UCLA because she had a beautiful house on Malibu, but they had to commute out there, and she lost her community. She had a breakup with Wilhelm Malkus, and so she really wasn't happy. So she moved from there to NOAA. It wasn't NOAA yet, but she moved there to the Weather Bureau, which became ESSA, which became NOAA. And and was given an opportunity to be an experimental meteorologist. But she ran back into the nepotism rules where no two NOAA employees could be both in the same field. So she was in research, Bob had to be in administration. And Bob was administering the National Hurricane Center, and Joanne was into experimental meteorology, where she ran her convection models, and then she would go out into the field, mostly in Florida, to see what the convection was like and whether their seeding was making any difference. She really chafed at the bureaucracy and didn't like the way that the NOAA administration was forcing this thing to make it rain rather than to study rain. They wanted operational rainmaking to come out of that. She wanted to study how clouds work, not to make the clouds work for the nation. They schemed a way to get out of the NOAA situation. It was there 10 years. They liked the area. They were on the beach. They were in Coral Gables and able to go out sailing a lot. So they moved to University of Virginia, where it was kind of a false promise. They were going to give Bob a position, but they never gave it to him. They gave Joanne a tenured position, endowed professorship in environmental science, and they were horribly misogynist at Virginia. They chafed. They didn't want to go to a faculty meeting with a woman. They didn't want to get involved with her on the campus. And she spent most of her time in Gate at that time. She went to the African project, the Global Atlantic Tropical Experiment, the GARP Atlantic Tropical Experiment. And again, when she got a chance, she was able to bail out of Virginia and then found her pace at NASA. The Severe Storms Branch gave her the opportunity to come down and to be the chief scientist in TRIM. At that time, again, in the period from '79 through her life, she reached the top of the AMS. Here's a picture of her as the president of AMS. I think this is at the Anaheim, so-called the Disneyland, the Mickey Mouse meeting. And these are all the past presidents. They're all guys. Many are known to us. And she is the woman president who instituted like the Board on Women and Minorities. She wanted to make sure that there were many more student opportunities, and was a positive influence on the AMS. This chart is, again, very busy, but the basic structure is that she did win a lot of major awards and honors, and she was the first female to do that. That's why we called her First Woman. She won the Rossby Medal, Research Medal in 1983. It was 17 years later till somebody else, Susan Solomon, won it again, a female awardee. She was elected to the National Academy of Engineering, first woman meteorologist in 1988, and it was 8 years later till Eugenia Calnet was elected. She was AMS president in 1989, and it was 15 years until the next woman was elected president. And she won the IMO Prize, which is only given on a sort of a decadal scale, in 2002, and then Eugenia Calnet, again, won it 7 years later. So there's a pattern there of pioneering. Here's the Rossby Medal. She said, if I mess up, every other woman will suffer for it, was one of her mantras. And she thought it was not unrealistic. So it's only by the time she had won the Rossby Medal, served as president of the AMS, and got elected to the National Academy, did she feel almost safe. Almost safe. And there's good evidence here that she did, in later life, attempt to reconcile with her mother. There's a whole section there where she went back to her mother. Her mother was ill, never gave anything to Joanne or the children, but gave something to the grandchildren. But she tried to reconcile. She said, at least my mother taught me to be self-sufficient. She taught me the value of study. She made a list of positives and made an attempt to reconcile with her mother. There's a lot more. It's all in the book too. But this is the one that the Japanese and NASA joint Tropical Rainfall Measurement Mission, TRIM, and she ended up with that first downward-looking radar looking at the tropics and being able to tell something more about the precipitation intensity, patterns, and height of the convection. So this was her baby. And it lasted a lot longer than they thought. It lasted after her lifetime. It didn't run out of steam until after she passed. And it gave birth, I think, and so there might be people here that have better understanding of that history, but it led in a way to the GPM and the global precipitation monitoring. It was supposed to be both humanitarian and scientific effort. But as I'm understanding, I heard about this today, that the scientific mission was ahead of the humanitarian. It's hard for nations in the tropics to take on the results of this kind of scientific study. But there's 40% of the world's people live in the tropics, and the tropics are the most vulnerable to some of this, both drought and flooding and severe storms. This is Jeff Halverson, a postdoc. Now he moved to the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and I was able to, actually he approached me. He says, "You're working on Joanne Simpson?" He basically loved the lady and loved to work with her. And what the point here was that she was a mentor. One of the key things she did was raise up a new generation of tropical meteorologists and space scientists. And she wasn't discriminatory. She raised up men and women. And so there's a whole cadre of men and you know, she's on that, the AMS did a great big chart of tropical meteorology's heritage and sort of genealogy of tropical. And she's right in there with lots of people she influenced, but she never had a lot of graduate students. She never spent a lot of time at these universities. And most of the others had long lineages of people coming out of universities. She did it because she was a great mentor. So let's play, might not play all of it, but let's play part of it from Jeff. Oh, sorry. Did I do that?
So what was it like to work with Joanne at NASA? The postdoc years, I call them, because I had 6-7 years working with Joanne. I stayed at Goddard for an extended postdoc period just because she was there, and we were working on exciting things. We were flying in these hurricanes, we were collecting the data, we would come back, analyze the data, and you know, it was a very interesting process working with Joanne. She had a huge office, huge office, and you know, she had an assistant and all that, but all on the walls around her were her books, and then she had one shelf that she would call precious books, and the precious books were never, ever to be loaned out to anyone. That's why they were called precious books, and that shelf was labeled as such, right? And of course you had, you know, the Real and Malchus, and you had, you know, all the classics there from tropical meteorology. Well, anyway, the working process with all these huge binders of data, we had computers back then, but Joanne and I were kind of tactile. We'd like to put out analysis charts and ASCII, you know, runs of data, and that's just getting into it, right? So we could write on it and circle things, and we would talk about a storm. We were trying to build a hypothesis chain and talk about this process leading to such process, and we would just open up the folders and pull out what we needed, and on the floor, she and I got down on knees and just spread this stuff out, and the images of the hurricanes, the SKU-T plots, the data, we would just organize this stuff in a way that constructed a conceptual hypothesis chain. This is proving this, and this leads to this, and here's the evidence for this. And it was just an amazing way to do science. You just get down on the floor with your mentor and say, we're going to look at stuff. And we didn't care who was walking by, who was looking. You know, that's just how we did the science. And that's one of the most amazing things I remember about Joanne is this: we could just lose ourselves for hours, just talking nothing but science and looking at data. And she had the most amazing amount of enthusiasm and motivation. It was infectious. I caught the bug, right? And then I would feed back to her because she saw my excitement, and that would keep her going. And so that's how we published a lot of our papers.
Okay. So a postdoc's perspective. This is Christina Katsaros, who's her husband Michael was a cartoonist as well, and they gave this to her on her. She had many retirements. She retired from NOAA. She retired from NASA, and they gave this to her in 2003 when she retired from NASA. And there's the optimist is knocking on the door for opportunity, but it's a closed door. The intrepid person is knocking down the wall, but the wise woman is flying over it. That's Joanne in the airplane, breaking all the boundaries by being better than, she said, I have to compete in a man's world, I have to be better than them, I have to work harder. They were happy in later life, Bob and Joanne. Claude had passed away years before, but still kept a spot in Joanne's heart. And she was happy with her grandchildren. They brought the family back together, the dispersed family with the two different divorces. They never had children, Bob and Joanne, but they had the grandchildren and the blended family. And so this is in her retirement documents from Noah. From Thoreau, if one advances confidently in the direction of her dreams and endeavors to live the life which she has imagined, she will meet with a success unexpected in common hours. So that's Joanne Simpson. That's how I remember meeting her, only on occasion, but she was the leading woman of tropical meteorology. And I thank you for that. Hot towers. Thank you. Q&A, huh?
That was fantastic. That was fantastic. So we can take questions and comments. Is anyone here in the audience? If anyone asks a question, we need to do it via the mic because this has been A, recorded, and B, folks are online. So any questions? Yeah. Andy, come up to the mic if you can. It's probably live. Yeah, you come up to the mic.
Hello. Oh, okay. Hi. So my PhD dissertation was hot tower. So I have a special feeling of hot tower. I have been studying for PhD all the way. So I learned Joanne Simpson for long. So I always wondered, she has so many difficulty living in the manned world, but she always pursued her dreams, right? She kept going. What do you think that like she didn't give up? Like I think around that time, not only Johannes, but other women also try to do the same thing, but not many people succeeded, right? But why Joanne so special? Why she kept going, you think?
Why did she keep going? Yeah. Intrinsic motivation. She was determined to, she was the best student in her Cambridge group. She was the star at Chicago who was able to take off and start a new field with Herb Reel. She was motivated to, again, there was that personal motivation to prove to her mother that she was worthy. And I just think she had incorporated a kind of a love for this and then a gritty determination to just do the best possible that she could. She also had personal health problems, and people that knew her late in life knew that she was really quite ill. And she also had some psychological problems. You would expect that from all the different batterings that have gone on in her life, from her mother to her graduate advisor to her two husbands. And so she was in a way, sui generis. She was generating her energy. And then I think it's another metaphor is like once a convective cell breaks through the boundary layer, it can condition the atmosphere for more to come through. So you get this occasion where once the convection gets started, it can encourage further convection. And so there was kind of a breakthrough with her and Peggy Limon when they did that study of women in meteorology. They kind of revealed that, and there's actually, the NCAR archives has all these interviews with women about what year was it? About 1975. And we were hoping that there would be a lifting of the restrictions so we could see the actual interviews. But right now there's still a restriction on it. But I think she broke through and let other people into the field. Also, there was a change of attitude in the country. There was encouragement of women in science. But she was like there breaking through the hot tower that allowed for further convection.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Anyone else in the room?
Did anybody work with her or?
Not
it was a while ago.
I interacted with her a number of times, but not work with her like the postdoc.
Not like that.
No. Any other comments or questions in the room? We'd have just a comment online. It's just a great comment. I just want to read it out because it's no real questions because probably aren't questions, but although Peter's going to come up with a question.
Peter.
And this is from Peter Kalmus, and he basically I just want to read this because it's, it's reflective of what a lot of people think, I think. Gosh, I said this was so awful and said so far, but let's forget that. The person or people working the cameras in the room are doing an outstanding job, folks. Well done. I really feel like I'm there. What a fascinating seminar. And others said they agree. So this has been a fantastic talk. I think it's been fascinating. It makes you wish that when I first met her in the late 70s, I wish I spent more time thinking about her and what she had done. Just makes me wish I could roll the clock back, Peter, have you got a question, comment?
Yeah. Oh, there we go. Okay. Yeah, I had one opportunity to meet with her, which was pretty special. What did she call the bookshelf again? What did the precious bookshelf?
Precious.
Was that her metaphorical teddy bear?
Could have been.
Right. Well, comment. Yeah, I mean,
Because actually, when Joanne was moving from Woods Hole to UCLA, they were in the middle of a really rough period with Malchus, and they had to give up housekeeping. She lost all of her precious stuff except for a couple photo albums. And so she had to, in a way, reconstruct her memories of their life, and so she did lose a lot from her early childhood, but she gained it by putting it unselfishly into the archives. And if you see, it was a Chris Kumaro's interview. It's on the YouTube, and he talks about her going to bat with the NASA administration to get their TRIM project going, and to keep it going with funding. And he breaks up at the end of the interview. He's, I really, really appreciate the advice she gave me as a young postdoc. And he says, I think he ends the interview, says, I really love that woman. And that was mentorship at the highest level.
I remember I served on an academy panel back in I forget exactly when it was, but it was right at a precarious time when it looked like TRIM was going to collapse and not go forward. I mean, it was proposed, and then as we moved forward in NASA's books, and then it was under threat for some reason or other, must be budget constraints and so on. And I remember Joanne coming to the academy, our panel, really kind of going to bat and made just such a compelling story about. I mean, I as an atmospheric scientist knew it was a no-brainer. We had to do this, but others in the panel didn't, and so she was probably as much as anyone else singularly responsible for the movement of TRIM forward, in my view. So, any other comments from anyone? Tom, and then Tom. Okay. Eric, you come after Tom.
Okay. Yeah.
Which, was it both of you? Both, yeah. Two Erics. Okay, Tom first, then Eric 1 and Eric 2.
Yeah, okay. Well, I knew Joanne through Vern Sumi, my advisor. They were both at Chicago together, knew one another. And Joanne did something at the AMS besides being president. She was the chair of the Science and Technology group for quite a while, which overseed all the meetings. And something for all of us to remember, she actually revolutionized the way the meetings went at AMS. She came in and cleaned house. She said, these meetings are terrible. Said that the speakers are stupid, or, in a nice way, and they're too rushed. They don't have time to give their papers, and the chairpersons, are not doing their job. And boy, she cleaned house. And after that, she'd sit in the front of whatever session she could go to, and she would call out people, this is too rushed. He gets to ask more questions or answer more questions. And so that's something to take for all of us that participate in meetings, and take Joanne's advice. Give people time. Make sure people ask good questions, and if they get into a commercial about their own work, cut them off quick.
Well, that happens too much.
right.
Eric one and then Eric two.
Yeah, actually, this is a question for Eric also. We are basically living through history. You know, in some sense, we're all Joanne Simpson. We could tell stories about our own lives that might be maybe not quite as passionate or compelling. I've only been married once. My question to the historians is, what can we do as participants in this to make your job easier? You know, this is, aside from giving you big stacks of paper. I mean, as conversations with Eric, maybe this is a 2-hour discussion, but just wanted to put that out there.
Sure. Well, we had that informal discussion this morning about the importance of history, and scientific audiences are wonderfully receptive to that. And our committee at AMS, we made this recommendation that people preserve their personal papers or their scientific papers, and that they might consider participating in an oral interview where they can tell about their pathway through science, and other kind of activities to preserve the what my dissertation advisor called the usable past. Don't foreshorten the usable past just because your project's done and you put some things in the journal on the scientific side, but allow that full dimensionality of your work and your interests to come forward. And you'll find a way to do that. You don't have to do it even just later in life. Just do it whenever you think about ways to contribute. And there's interview people. There's people that'll do tape recorded interviews with you if you're interested in that.
All right, Jim. So you know the idea of an intellectual thought collective, the idea that you can make an intellectual school, even though you're not all at one institution. The Chicago School of Economics is a famous one, and there's others. So do you think Joanne Simpson had a school of tropical tropical meteorology? And if so, who are the followers? Who are the leaders of that school now that she's passed?
Good question. And a lot of people have passed, and we'd have to include Herb Reel in the group. But on that genealogy that the meteorologists made, they have Joanne without a graduate program, but with all of these people that were dedicated to her as their mentor. So that would include the Kumaros of the world. I've got Warren Washington on tape saying that she pioneered cloud subroutines to go into the global climate models. Bill Cotton's on tape. Roger Pilkey was very, and so the Colorado State people did subroutines that were based on Joanne's work.
So you can trace back the development of what we call cloud models all the way back to Joanne. You mentioned it. Today now we're in an era where we're talking about cloud models, and now the new global models, the new Earth system models will be basically cloud models run at the scale that cloud models were run kind of conceptually back then. So the new generation models, you can essentially trace many elements of those back to Joanne. So there's an example of this pyramid. It starts with Joanne, but there's this pyramid effect. Trim clearly was she was a champion. That's led to GPM, but there's elements that go beyond that now. Even AOS, which is not meant to be a GPM follow-on, has GPM flavors in it. So you can trace her influence in many ways, but there was always a school of tropical meteorology, and she was part of that school. The school with the Herb Reel, and then there was the Bill Grays, and they were like a clan. And when they met, you knew they were a clan because they would gravitate and always want to gravitate to each other when they went to universities where the other ones worked. So there definitely was a clan. I don't know whether there's a clan so much today as there was back then, but the fingerprints of her are all over the place. We might lose sight of those fingerprints and not realise it. I mean, the early career folks probably don't realise it, but her fingerprints are kind of everywhere.
And just to add to that, since we're in a satellite group, she was truly impressed by what was the possibility with the GATE, because they had some overflights of satellites, and they had the aircraft array, they had the ground and ship observations, and there's some place in there where she's reporting on her GATE experience. And she says, oh my goodness, what possibilities are there? She kind of has this moment almost like Wilhelm Bjerknes, that someday we're going to solve this Gordian knot of provision, And Joanne had that kind of prophetic realization at Gate that satellites were going to come on. They weren't there yet, but they were going to be really, really important. So I think it's part of that heritage too.
Okay, well, what we'll do, because we're at the hour, or past the hour actually, we'll call it the end and thank Jim for what was been a fascinating seminar.
Thank you.
And hopefully we'll see you